Hot dog money. The doling out of money for small expenses and entertainment. In this context, primarily utilized in college athletics to fund basic needs for the student athlete outside what they receive in the payment scholarship given to them by the universities. I.e., hot dog money helps fund these kids' good times while in school. But for those of us not being inappropriately fawned over by nefarious characters attempting to weasel their way into our lives, we get our hot dog money from OddsShopper. With OddsShopper's Plus EV tools, you can rest assured your sports betting wagers are beating the market and giving you those glizzy dollar holas needed for a night out with the boys. Sign up via the show notes or goodjujubets.net and let us know. We're happy to help show you the ropes.
We can't lose. No, we can't lose.
Enjoy it while it lasts. Gambling gods, fickle bunch. Oh yeah, so easily
We
affected.
have a shooter and a good one coming out for a new point. Get your bets down, ladies and gentlemen. He's a rolling point is 9, place 9. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen.
They bet on absolutely anything. Don't make them prove it.
There's anybody that I kind of felt a little aggrieved by, it was the mainstream sports media.
You're tuned in to Gambling with Good JuJu.
Welcome in, everybody, to Gambling with Good JuJu, the show that eats more glizzies than Joey Chestnut on date night. You see, Joey probably cuts back some for date night, but I bet it's still a lot.
Right.
So
I bet so.
maybe between the three of us, we could do that. Well, we're getting warmed up here. Do us a favor and like, follow, subscribe. Hit that button on your favorite podcast platform that lets them know you appreciate what we're doing. We're beyond excited to talk this episode with the author of Hot Dog Money, Inside the Biggest Scandal in the History of College Sports, Guy Lawson. The book is available now, wherever and however you get books. Read it now, before the movie comes out, so you can say you were cool and in on this story way before George Clooney was attached to it.
Right. And you heard it from us?
Yeah. So this week, we're all hot dog money, all episode. We're skipping the heat check, boys. Instead, let's take some time to talk about why I was so excited to talk with Guy and hear his perspective on this story.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
All right, so let's get into this. Hot dog money. What is hot dog money? Inside the biggest scandal in the history of college sports, which hit stands June 1st, is a telling of the FBI's investigation into college basketball recruiting methods, which involve payments not only to college basketball players, college football players, their families, but to major players at shoe companies, and ultimately payments to college coaches and other staff members. Now, before we get to Guy's interview, let's start with a brief overview. Throughout this interview, you're going to hear about Marty Blazer, a financial manager, life manager for NFL players. He obtained these relationships by forging connections with individuals close to these athletes while still in college, feeding them hot dog money to help with costs that a typical college scholarship would not cover. While these payments were illegal, they were not considered controversial, nor did they have anything to do with Marty Blazer's personal story, which involved embezzlement from his own clients and led to him ultimately choosing to become an informant in a case unrelated to his own woes. Other points of consideration that you'll want to keep in mind throughout this story. We do learn that the investigation into this case takes an abrupt turn, not through the actions of Marty Blazer or the NCAA, but of the FBI agents responsible for the case. Special Agent Carpenter is a name you'll hear referenced, as he was Marty's primary handler throughout the course of the undercover operation. Many coaches beyond the names mentioned in the book, many known by Guy himself, as he subtly alluded to in his conversation with us, are not named today, and as he references with the recent court rulings against the NCAA, still has done nothing to address the core issue that drives the demand for these type of operators working in the gray. Couple other notes. Some of the names he mentions Rick Pitino during our conversation and Will Wade. Major head coaches were openly caught in the course of this investigation discussing on FBI recordings payments to players. And these coaches, almost to a man, I'm not sure where Will Wade is right now, but almost to a man, they're all head coaches right now in the NCAA. So that is when you hear that conversation from Guy talking about, well, what does it all mean and what does it all represent and where's the NCAA in all this? I mean, you see a lot of who bears responsibility for all this. So ultimately, we still find ourselves in a situation that, unless torn to the ground and rebuilt, isn't going to continue with anything other than seedy operators taking advantage of those most in need of protection. The teenagers caught up in believing the influential people in their lives are truly operating from a sincere desire for the athlete and the athlete alone. And I don't think any of those issues are ultimately addressed with what we're seeing take place right now and the decisions being enacted against the NCAA. And I think Guy references that as well in this conversation and talks to that. So
I was just about to say, what is it, like 2-point-something billion? It's just a fraction of the money that they've
The proposed
paid,
amount.
that they've paid for these players, essentially.
$2.8 billion settlement. The entire percentage payout between the universities and what they keep and what goes to the athlete, as referenced by Guy in the conversation, is just enormously different. So hopefully that sets the stage for the conversation you're about to hear. But before we go to that, let's take a little time to talk about why this was something Breezy had to get into for the show. This topic's not gambling related, but it is intrinsically tied to gambling, both through the actions of the parties involved and the act responsible for ultimately bringing the investigation to an end. In Vegas, no less. So I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form I am an expert on this topic, but I am a nerd. I was at the University of Illinois when Dee and Darren and Lutherhead were all there, and we lost to North Carolina in the national championship game. And after college, steady decline in Illinois basketball. And I reached a point after college, I was like, hey, I have the internet. We used to have all these good players, and now we don't. Why is that? And so I just went and Googled it, and I found this website, illinoisloyalty.com. And on there, they have these threads just dedicated to basketball recruiting, football recruiting, so on and so forth. And so I got really interested in it because this gave you your hope for the future. Okay, we're no good right now, but don't worry. Jeremy Richmond's coming. Myers Leonard's coming. Brandon Paul's coming. All these dudes are coming. Turns out they did come. They were okay. We never reached those heights with Bruce Weber that we had under Bill Self.
Well, one of the things I told you I was going to bring up specifically for this pre-conversation was Anthony Davis.
Exactly.
Being from Chicago.
We were not in on Anthony Davis. We were in on Anthony Davis before Anthony Davis grew 8 inches or whatever in one summer out of nowhere and became a number 1 overall prospect. It was at that point that he gets involved instead with Kentucky. And there were rumors all over, open rumors. I mean, you'd go to Illinois Loyalty and you would read about it and they're like, yeah, AD's going to get the bag. And these people know people in Chicago. They know what's going on. They're like, yeah, that's not how Illinois is really operating. And I'm not saying Illinois wasn't doing anything then,
Sure.
but we weren't doing anything well. And you can imagine when Bruce Weber is your head coach, your ability to hand out the bag is a little different than when Bill Self is your head coach, right?
100%.
Right. So you saw the precipitous drop at Illinois under Bruce Weber, and then it continued with John Gross, where I felt like John Gross probably had the understanding of what was going on, and he tried to pursue a lot of those people giving out those bags. And when he ultimately lost them, he lost them to someone who just did it a little better than him. And then we bring in Brad Underwood. Do you know where Brad Underwood was the year before he was at Illinois? Oklahoma State. One of the key schools brought up in this whole investigation is Lamont Evans, who went from South Carolina to Oklahoma State, was underneath Brad Underwood.
He was there?
Yeah. So Brad Underwood comes to Illinois. You know, one of the first coaches he hires is a guy by the name Orlando Antigua. Do you know who Orlando Antigua is?
No clue.
John Calipari's shark. So we had Orlando on our staff early, and then he gets pulled away by Kentucky after a few years, and we had gotten Kofi and we had gotten Io. And then he goes away to Kentucky, and then when everything went down with Calipari going back to Arkansas, Orlando comes back to Illinois.
Oh, neat.
So we've had 2 different stints of Orlando Antigua. We have other assistant coaches who clearly know what they're doing. And suddenly you see Illinois putting out a roster that's stacked with European pros and 5-star transfers from other programs. We went to an Elite Eight this year. You're going to see us right back battling next year within a completely new roster. Everyone's new. We have like one player left from last year.
Wow.
And we're still going to be good. And if we manage to hold on to all those dudes, they're free agents every year, but who knows? We'll be really good the year after. And what's become crazy in this NIL environment is they are openly talking about all these contracts now and everything. But we still don't see, at the face value, the underseedy stuff that's still going on in the background behind it all. So, real passionate about me, for me personally, really excited to actually get into that conversation with Guy. I think that'll do it for us. You guys feel good?
Yeah, it was a great interview. I really like Guy.
I did too.
Yeah.
All right, folks, stick around. Interview with Guy Lawson coming up. We're going to get down and dirty with all the details of the biggest scandal in the history of college sports. Good juju to your bets, folks. We'll talk again 2 weeks. Guy, welcome into the show. Before we get to the book, how closely, in general, did you follow college basketball prior to your participation in this book?
You know, I had a girlfriend at one point who was a former cheerleader for the Tar Heels. So that was like a time in my life where I was kind of got into it. It was a pretty peak period for North Carolina. I mean, I'm like a casual observer. I didn't go to school in America. I've lived here a long time. I have something that I describe as ironic closeness to the United States. I grew up next door in Canada mostly, and then Australia and England. And it just sort of, I'm fluent. I speak the language, but it's not my native tongue, if you know what I mean. So I know college sports very well, but I don't have a team that I cheer for in particular. But as a person who studies corruption and American institutional decline, if you want to call it that, or if it's declining from any spot, I don't even know that it's ever been anything different. College sports to me was evidently a very broken institution. It just struck me that lots of people know that. Maybe everybody kind of knows that, including the colleges and the NCAA. It's like this kind of open secret that people are all operating by. I don't know what the good analogy would be, but I liken it in the book to organized crime. It's just sort of one of those things that's just existing in the water. Everybody sort of loves the fairy dust of amateurism and the idea that they're just playing for their school, even though they know it's nonsense. And even though that's just basically a minor league development for pros. So I don't know quite how to explain that kind of collective delusion, but it's definitely an American thing.
Well, maybe I can help by contributing to that. I've been following for my own university, like the online message board forums and things like that really, I mean, there are massive communities out there talking about high school, grade school, all those sorts of activities.
It's like Tinder, but for sports.
Yeah. And
all these lonely people.
And you would hear about it way before like this FBI investigation. I mean, and they would talk about it online in public spaces under anonymous accounts and stuff. And the things that they would say come true. Yeah. You would know the information that they're putting out there is accurate. So
yeah. I mean, that was the attraction for me. Marty Blazer, the main character in the book, approached me, and I was working on something else at the time. And it happens that people come to me, criminals come to me from time to time, but usually it's difficult to find a story in it, let alone a story that can carry a book. But Marty was bound and determined to tell his story, and it took me a little minute to figure out, well, okay, so what's really different about this story? As you say, it's corruption in college. As I say at one point in the book, it's like writing a book about air. It's just everywhere, right? Like it's like investigating air. But when you think about it, Marty had a unique position. He was a guy who really knew the details, really knew the ins and outs of it. And he was going to he was out of the game, could never go back, convicted felon. And he's just like, you know what? I'm the one guy, the one mobster. I'm like the, Sammy the Bull Gravano, or Catch Me. He called himself Catch Me If You Can. I'm like the guy that knows how to kite checks and how to fake things. I'm going to tell you how it works. And there's a scene in the book where at the end of this whole years-long adventure of undercover, first of all, being a corrupt financial advisor for NFL players, then being an undercover for the FBI in college basketball. At the end of this, I think it was after the trials, but Marty hadn't been, after all the convictions, all the press, and all the sort of publicity around it, Marty got a note that the NCAA wanted to come in and have him explain to them what had really gone on. So he goes, meets with them in a conference room at a hotel near the airport in Pittsburgh, and spends 8 hours detailing the ins and outs, like who took 10 grand, who took 50 grand, which players were trafficked in and out of these things. And the NCAA knew none of this because it hadn't been in the press. This book has got a lot of new material. And at the end of this 8 hours, Marty says, well, do you have any questions? Any follow-ups? And the guys look around the NC, there's like a dozen of them. They look around and go, no, I think you've covered it. Thanks very much, Mr. Blazer. It's like they don't want to know. They actively do not want to know. So if we want to talk about where the NCAA is now, I'm happy to. But it is a strange phenomenon, the way that American people, like, what's your school? What school did you go to?
I went to the University of Illinois. So one quick question for you, actually. What years were you really into North Carolina?
In the 90s.
Okay. So 2004, 2005, Illinois played North Carolina for the national title.
Yeah.
I was a student there. Don't worry about it, Guy. I'm not going to hold you personally accountable, but it was stark. That's how into college athletics we get, right?
It didn't make it into the book, but your school was in this. There was a coach at your school who got caught up in this, but there was so much, what percentage of coaches were approached with FBI bribes on wire? What percentage do you think took the money?
Well, I read your book in less than 36 hours, so I know the answer to this, Guy.
What do your buddies think?
What do you guys think? I gave you a little. I think I might have told them.
Yeah, you spilled the beans on that.
It's 100%.
100%. You'd think there'd be one guy who'd say, "Hang on, I'm in a $4,000 a night Las Vegas suite, trafficking an 18-year-old kid to some guy who looks like a mobster and his buddy.
Right.
What am I doing here, man? Like, hold on. How did I get let off this leash that far?" And I know that there's an underlying kind of, again, these kind of underscored elements. It's always interesting to me how the truth can be shared but then not spoken. And in this case, I think the coaches thought this was all kind of just easy money. These guys are stupid. Just take their stupid money and enjoy Las Vegas, without thinking that, oh, well, what's that little camera up there? Why is he wearing that lapel badge? It looks like a microphone. So, but there's a kind of, even when they got caught, these coaches, right? And the media, the mainstream sports media covered it. They were more sympathetic to the coaches than they were to Marty Blazer. Marty was pretty much universally portrayed as the jerk. The guy that was trying to keep himself out of prison and more or less entrapped these mostly black guys. And it's just like, well, have a look. Who was taking the money? What were they doing with it? So, yeah, 100%.
So let me ask this then, because there's a lot of different storylines throughout the course of this book. And what I'm curious about, which of these storylines kind of was the biggest appeal to you in deciding to write this?
I've written a lot about law enforcement over the years and corruption inside law enforcement. My first book was about two New York City police detectives who were hitmen for the mafia. I wrote a story for GQ magazine called The Knife, which was about a member of the Crips who basically got turned in by his brother Crips when he was a kid for a stolen car, and he's just took revenge by going undercover for the FBI for a decade. And he put like more than 150 Crips in prison. And I learned a lot about undercover, the use of cooperating witnesses and informants. In fact, I developed and was ready to pitch a series called Snitches, a documentary series that was going to document, because it's a pervasive thing in this society. People don't realize, if anyone ever asks you to break the law, ever, they're almost certainly a snitch. That's just the reality. Don't do it. Don't agree to do it. Don't talk about it. Because there's tens of thousands of these guys out there like Marty trying to stay out of prison, and they're going around fomenting these things. Now, you would think it would be entrapment, but it isn't. So for me, the most interesting thing was Marty was willing to throw down about corruption in football in, I thought, a new and original way. He really was throwing down about corruption in basketball and really sort of writ large. But I'd never heard anyone talk about law enforcement quite the way Marty did, because it's like, I knew it to be true. I've seen, the FBI agent who ran that Crip guy He's a nice guy and everything, but he didn't really understand that the Crip guy was actually a vigilante. He was giving him criminals that he wanted to put in, not that the FBI wanted. And the FBI didn't ask questions because they wanted the cases. This guy was becoming a hero. But this Crip guy was like, I don't like people that have sex with underage girls. I'm going to set that guy up. I'm going to go wear a wire on that guy. I heard this guy was threatening my neighbor's little brother. I'm going to get that guy. I mean, it was just incredible. And he knew it. And he told me, and he said about the FBI agent, he said, you know, when we were talking privately, he's like, the FBI doesn't have a clue what I'm doing. So I really felt like Marty was an honest broker with this thing. You know, like what he got the investigation to a place where they really could have gone, really could have killed the NCAA. The NCAA is going to kill itself. It's in the process of killing itself anyway. And this case was a significant contributor to that. But it was the portrait of the FBI that I really, that made me think, okay, this is a book I want to write.
Okay, so let's talk about the FBI then for a second while we're on that. The FBI ultimately comes off looking even worse than the NCAA somehow in this story. It appears on face value they did almost no research into the proper tactics to engage in, given the circumstances of the case. Is this a problem given your background of, you know, the case landing on the desk of some bottom feeder at the Bureau, or does this speak to a broader pattern of behavior by the department in general?
I think there's a couple of answers to that. The first thing that leaps to mind is when you go into the FBI, you typically, and I think almost always, have a college degree and some experience in another field. You know, you might have been an accountant, you might have been an attorney. Most often it's military. So what you have is guys that are rule followers, and they're going into worlds of rule breakers. And they just don't have the nous. They don't understand it. They can't get the language. They can't get the subtext. They think, number one, that they're righteous. They don't inspect themselves for their own motivations. And that's, I think, a common mindset for military and law enforcement. Like, I'm the badge guy. They have that mentality. So they don't say, whoa, hey, man, what's the moral quality here? So that's one part of it. I also think that there's like a kind of an institutional arrogance that in the Bureau, the kind of we can't do wrong. But you put those together with a kind of bully boy mentality, and it leads down bad paths. So for me, I don't know quite how you solve that. What I've described in this conversation is like the FBI using thousands and thousands of these informants who are inherently devious, right? Like they're criminals that are trying to stay out of prison. So they're like double, triple devious. That's the thing about Marty. Marty was living 3-4 different existences. He was like a suburban dad in Pittsburgh. He was a money manager. He was a criminal. He was an informant. You know, he was picking and choosing. I mean, there's one point. This is the moment when I thought I'm going to write this book. So Marty finally convinces, after a couple of years of doing it on his own, that convinces the FBI to fund the investigation. And the FBI says to him, you're going to focus on 2 people. One's the son of a coach that Marty's friends with, and the other is a agent lawyer guy who is definitely a player in the game. And Marty said to me, I was never going to go after my friend's son. And I said, did the FBI ever ask you about that? He goes, no one's ever asked me about that. You're the first person to notice that. That's in a nutshell what I'm talking about with the FBI. They don't know that they're getting played. They don't know that a guy like Marty has got an agenda as long as his arm to satisfy. They think they're setting the agenda. So in a way, it's like they're getting outwitted is kind of it. So you see these press conferences, FBI does this, you know, Southern District does that. There's almost always a Marty behind it that's really making it happen. So to me, I was like, oh God, now that's a story that I know to be true. I couldn't write about it with that Crip guy for a variety of reasons. Mostly it was just in a magazine context. So it's hard to expose something like that complicated and important in the context of 6,000 words. You need a book to really get yourself there. But there are some turns in this story where you start to sort of really turn the screw on your understanding of law enforcement. So that I like to think that's from a lifetime. I was a lawyer. I practiced law. I quit to be a journalist. I've been studying law enforcement for, you know, my whole career really. And my first book, as I say, is called The Brotherhoods, which I think it might be becoming a movie sometime soon. It's about those NYPD hitmen, the police cop hitmen. And I wrote the story about the main cop who caught them. And he just was a fantastically cynical, smart detective who, he was like, I was like, is it kung fu? You snatch grasshopper, you can snatch the pebble from my hand. He like taught me all the tricks of martial arts, like how to get a guy to talk. Like if you want someone to flip, as they call it, right? Like they're, like you see going on in the press now. There's ways to do that, right? You move them around from federal facility to federal facility. You lose their meds. You put them in air-conditioned, deeply, really cold rooms. You just torture them, and then you say, "Well, you want to talk now? You want to talk now?" So it's just like that kind of mindset. But the FBI, I mean, the mafia used to call them famous but incompetent. So that's kind of the portrait that comes along with this book. So I knew it to be deeply true. And when Marty started talking to me in this way, I've never seen the FBI like kind of talked about in this way.
Right.
That was interesting to me. I kind of halfway wonder if they've opened a case on me.
Right. I mean, I hope so. So we learned throughout the book the ultimate convictions of relatively minor NCAA characters such as Christian Dawkins, Rashawn Michelle, Tony Bland, and Merle Code. These were the individuals who accepted bribes from Blazer with promises to deliver high-value college athletes to him after they became professional athletes. You portray quite succinctly how this was to be the very start of climbing the ladder and identifying the most responsible parties for these practices. Who ultimately was the target of the FBI then?
Well, that's just it. The target, I think, was the press conference. It was the announcement. It was the glory. It's I don't know if you use potty words, but it was BS. That's not a joke, really. I'm really not like, it's funny, but it's not a joke. It's like the Declaration of Victory. We have your playbook. That is kind of like the bravado. That's what pissed Marty off about it, was because they were in a position to. This was a unique time. No, this is a unique time and an opportunity. They had the opportunity, as Christian Dawkins says, and you're correct to say that he's a relatively minor figure in the scheme of things, but Tony Bland wasn't so minor. I mean, he was on his way to becoming head coach at a big program. Merle Code was not so minor. He was running probably the biggest grassroots program in the country, and bringing along the next generation of superstars. So it's minor in the sense that it wasn't Rick Pitino or Will Wade or the head coaches. But as I say in the book, and I don't think that this is new per se, but I think it's new in how it's understood in detail. Head coaches don't do the dirty work. Their assistants do the dirty work. When Marty was trying to get into Alabama, it's it could be the weight coach, because what you're trying to do is get to the kid. You're trying to find out who the kid trusts, who the kid will listen to, and the coaches, the head coaches, they know what's going on. And if they don't, it's because they actively don't want to know, because they're being protected, because they make millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
But it's as I say, it's like investigating air. It's just everywhere. It's pervasive.
Prior to the events that took place in Las Vegas, the FBI had in mind targets above and beyond this that then got cut off as a result of the events that took place in Las Vegas?
That's a good question. I mean, there's no available evidence that they did, in the sense that it wasn't like aspirational, but that's part of the dynamic between these cooperators and the FBI. And part of the way they get so diluted is that they think they're running the informant, when, very often the informant who comes from that environment. So Marty knew how college sports work. He knows what the next level and the next level are, because he's been held out from it, right? Like when he never got to see how the sneaker companies interact until he got FBI money to start bribing his way into these meetings. So there's no available evidence per se. Part of me thinks that they didn't want to go there because it's just too much. It's just too much. People love college sports. There's an amount that people will take about their beloved entertainment industry, and then there's an amount they won't take, right? Like, if all of a sudden every, movie star is, a different gender or something, like everything's just thrown upside down, people are not happy about that. So, you want to believe in the Illinois, you want to believe that your team's maybe a little different, or you don't want to have to stop watching them, right? Like you don't want to have to give that up.
Right.
So on some level, it's almost like self-regulatory. You see it now in the NCAA's increasingly desperate attempt to stay alive through this name, image, likeness program, and now this proposed settlement. I've been writing about it for Rolling Stone. I don't know if you've seen those editorials. You might use them for Viz for this anyway. It's like part of the collective half-truth telling to ourselves, to Americans themselves, is like, just say it ain't so. Just say it ain't so. Let me keep my game. Let me watch the, March Madness without having to look at these people and see criminal conspiracies and see people who are kind of immoral.
So then this kind of brings the universities back into the fold for me. Given the nature of the investigation itself, a lot of focus on the FBI angle, a lot of focus on the coaches angle, not so much as discussed of the universities themselves. Personally speaking, in my mind, the most responsible individuals in all this are probably the university presidents who let it get to this place to begin with. But yet, in the course of this investigation, the universities are portrayed by the government as the victims in the case. I
mean, that's the upside down world, right? It's ridiculous. They are the predators.
Right.
These are revenue related sports. This is how they make their money, to build those fancy gyms and to give out those rowing scholarships and stuff like that, but also how they get their $3 million salary.
Right.
It's like there's nobody's interest is in really saying this is all bullshit. So they made them to be the victims. It's like literally the inverse. It's like blaming the little old lady who gets her purse snatched. It's like, you've got to be kidding me. It's like, oh God, it's just hilariously upside down.
Was it even in the FBI's purview to be able to go after institutions like the NCAA or like the universities themselves?
The evidence that was entered into trial, and it's in the book, which is a lot of it is new and untold. Marty and the FBI could have got to sit down with the Pope if they had the right amount of money. There was nobody was going to say no to this money. They could have got university presidents, athletic directors. I mean, they had the associate athletic director at Alabama, which never really got into the press properly. But I mean, one of his jobs was to protect kids from being preyed upon by the very people that he was taking money to allow exclusive access to. So, yeah, would they have got Rick Pitino in a meeting? We'll never know. Would they have got Will Wade in a meeting? Would they have got the president of Harvard in a meeting? Who was going to say no to this money? There was just that's the sort of like the sad stroke true part of this, which is, are there human beings that can withstand this form of temptation? And if there isn't, how do we get structures that, number one, protect and educate the kids so that they see what's going on around them in 3 dimensions? So in my view, this settlement, I know you'll probably talk about it in your intro, but this $2.8 billion settlement that the NCAA has proposed, that's basically the equivalent of someone saying, I've been stealing from you for 100 years. I'm going to continue to steal from you for the next 100 years, but now I'm going to give you 20% back. And that 20% is only going to be on future money. So it's not what I stole from you before. That's all off the table. So in my view, as I said in the Rolling Stone piece, one of the Rolling Stone pieces, a significant chunk of that of money that comes from any settlement. And remember, $2.8 billion is an opening offer. That's how desperate they are. That's not where it's going to land. If it does land, it's going to be like 10x that. So, but I think a really significant piece of that money should be put aside for every sport, every athlete that goes to college, Division III, Division IV, whatever, has to do a financial literacy course in the first semester where they learn about corruption. They learn about relationships between agents, money managers, what NIL deals can look like. The NCAA would have to regulate and enforce people who are interacting with the kids. That costs money. So there's a lot of ways. The person who is not portrayed as the victim in any of the legal proceedings or really anywhere but in this book are the kids. And the kids are the victims. That's the one through line in all these things. Even in the operation that they did with the celebrities sneaking their kids in, rich people getting their kids into Yale and USC and stuff like that broke a few years ago. Most of those kids, I'm not saying all, but most of those kids didn't know what their parents were doing. So it's like, you got to remember what it's like to be 17 and you've got these forces around you. I have 2 kids that just went off to university a couple of years ago. And guess they're going to school up in Canada because when you actually step back even a little step further back from sports and you look at the cost of college education and you look at the amount of student debt, you start to see that these institutions are really deeply troubled. Really, really deeply troubled. And so, yeah, the university president of the school that charges $80,000 So a kid can come out of college with $300,000 in debt. And, how do you start your life like that? So, yeah, I mean, you can make the aperture too wide, of course, but it's good to at least have a perspective on the nature of the problem. So for me, one of the first solutions would be to educate every kid that's going to do sports that has a possibility of an NIL or other kind of deal, that they've got to understand how sports finance works, at least on some level, to know the right questions.
Well, to support that for you real quick, Guy, anyone who's listened to this show or knows me personally is aware that I've felt for a long time that the college athletes who are entering these universities are better prepared for the reasons they're attending these universities than any general student attending that college is themselves. And that it's the university's responsibility to put them in positions for these massive industries that have been created. I mean, these are these are billions and billions of dollars of industries, not just college athletics, but what it can feed for their futures in professional athletics or in all the different industries that touch professional athletics. And it's the lack of vision and the lack of insight and the lack of understanding to what they've created that has prevented them from being able to properly accommodate these students when they come in. So,
I mean, you just think, for example, about, I know that you guys talk about it, gambling. Just think about the amount of money that sloshes around inside that world.
We're well aware.
And that these kids are exposed. Yeah, and these kids are exposed to that, right? Like, they're the engines of that. I mean, I bet you there's as much money bent on March Madness as any event in the country.
Right.
I don't know about the Super Bowl, but I'm sure it's close.
Let me get you to a couple fun questions before we let you go here. It's mentioned in an interview with you that Marty mentioned to you he was disappointed some of the more colorful stories didn't make it into the book. Anything you found particularly interesting you can share about Marty's story that didn't make it in?
Well, there's an interesting dynamic with that. One of the things that I've discovered over the years in interacting with people and telling their stories is that what people think is good and interesting is not necessarily what's good and interesting. And that's part of my job, is to make sure, like, talking about going to a club once or twice is good and fun, but doing it 300 times is not good or fun. So, there's an example in the book where I just thought it was the best example of Marty clubbing. So Marty wanted more clubbing in the book, and his wife wanted less clubbing in the book. So, but there's this one example where he took this guy down to Miami, and he was pretending that this guy was going to finance these corrupt payments. The guy didn't even know what was going on. Didn't even know why he was in Miami. He just thought he was hanging around with famous athletes. And the guy gets so hammered with Marty, they go to clubs, they go to a strip club. He's drinking so much. They're in the Uber on the way back, and the guy tells the Uber driver to pull over on the highway on the interstate. Marty thinks he's going to throw up. The guy gets out of the car and defecates on the highway. I figured, like, we'll do that one story, Marty. So, like, that gives you the flavor of where these guys are heading, these guys in their early 40s or whatever. So there's some of that. And I think that there's more, like, so as you no doubt know, Marty passed away at the age of 53, which is just like an unbelievably unexpected tragedy for his family and for him, not to see this book come into the world. But the last conversation I ever had with him, so the book was finished and went to the press on a Friday. And I know from experience that it can be a bit of a letdown when you finish a project that you've really been thinking about intently for years. Like, you have this image of it in your head. It's like this amorphous thing. And then there it is, that's it. That's what it is. It fits in there, right? It can feel like it isn't what you thought it would be. I thought we could get more of that clubbing in there. I thought that time that people don't understand about this and that. Because Marty was desperate to come on your podcast. He saw his role next as being basically like a really good podcast interview, and maybe even starting one of his own about NCAA corruption. So when Marty and I were talking, I said, "You sound a little bummed." And he said, "Well, I just more or less what I said, sometimes I wonder if it could have been better." And I said, "Well, Marty, when we started this project, I said to you, if you stick with it, if you take the time and put the energy in to organize your thoughts, because a lot of it has to do with him just having the discipline to sit and write down what happened so I could make sense of it, order it, structure it." I said, if you really, and this applies to any one of your lives, if you really sit down with yourself and say, I'm going to understand my marriage, or I'm going to understand my parenting, or I'm going to understand why it is I am the way I am. And he did that and he really did it diligently. It wasn't easy. Certainly at first it was very hard. He kind of had an OCD kind of compulsion. He bounced around, and I tried to interview him. It wasn't working because he'd move between 25 years in 2 sentences. And I'd say, no, just do it in order, Marty. And he's like, I can't. This is how my brain works. I'm like, well, it's not going to work. So do it this other way. So I said to him, did that happen for you? Did you get to understand why you did what you did in a better way? And he said, you know what? I'm really glad you asked me that. It did work for me. I did get to understand myself better. I know how this happened a lot better now that I put the time in, a couple of years of work, a real kind of like, this was his most precious thing, apart from his wife and kids, was this story. And I said, well, Marty, like, hang on to that, man. Like you've got something really, really wonderful for your life now. You understand yourself in this new way. And he says, you know what? You're right. I'm going to try to look at it that way. And he died 2 days later. I mean, I never thought that would be my last conversation. And it's almost like, I got the Audible book. I hadn't listened to it, and I just got it yesterday, day before yesterday. And I'm listening to it, and it's interesting to listen to your own book. And there's this passage where he's talking about how much stress he's under with all these different personas that he's inhabiting, like the father, the soccer dad, the informant, the corrupt guy, the eager FBI, happy to be part of the team guy. And he said at one point, I thought I could keel over at any moment. And then he did.
Wow.
So I don't know what to say about that. I went to his memorial service, and he's got 3 beautiful kids. His wife is just a lovely person. Got a great Italian greyhound named Newt. I mean, he's a good guy in his way. Like, we can be these different things. We all do contain multitudes, and Marty had that. And I hope when people read the book, they don't think, what would Marty have added? It's really more about Marty letting you in. I mean, he says in the very beginning of the book, in a letter he wrote to me, when I first started reporting this, he said, there's a lot of self-pity in here and in his diaries. And he said, but I have a really hard time letting people see the real me. And I think the book contains the real Marty. And the review in the Wall Street Journal yesterday said that very thing, that, he's passed on, but he left behind a really important story about college sports and about how we all kind of understand sports in America, and through that institutions, and through that ourselves. So, I'd like to think it's funny. I mean, I know that it's being developed for a movie. I don't know if you've seen that, but George Clooney bought the film rights, and I know the screenwriter that's working on it he's one of the guys from Succession. Mm-hmm. And nice. And how you have that crazy but true, kind of rings true dialogue kind of element to Succession. Yeah. It's actually funny too. Right. I think that's the tone they're going to go for. And that's really how Marty lived his life in a lot of ways.
Well, that's the thing I want to say here is because, talking with you here, there's so many serious undertones that go into all this, the impact on the college athletes, the corruption within the NCAA, the nightmare of a journey Marty himself had to go through. But there are also like woven in throughout this book, genuine comedic relief moments, in large part provided by the FBI themselves.
And that to me is like, that's for me in my world of writing these kinds of stories. I mean, they don't fall from trees. They are hard to find, these stories, but that's when you feel like you're really strumming the guitar, when all those 6 things can be true all at once. You just sort of feel like, wow. And I always say to people, you're doing something, you're on to something when you get up from your chair and burst out laughing when you write a sentence. Right. Like it's a really good sign that there's something that some other people might like too. Because, lots of times in this story, I just was like, oh, Marty, my God. And even when he's talking about the FBI, talking shit about the FBI, that's high wire stuff, right? Like, those people have a lot of different ways to make you uncomfortable in the world. And I felt like just for Marty's own good, occasionally I would just be like, we're not putting that in, Marty. That's too much. I mean, he'd start to.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not a person who's given to like holding back, like, at all. My only real reason to hold back is that it doesn't serve the story. That's really my only real reason. But yeah, no, we developed really quite a shorthand, Marty and I. Yeah. I mean, the thing about Hot Dog Money, a book, that I think might be one of the takeaways that you're talking about, which is it teaches you a language. If you listen to it closely, like they're talking to each other, these people, in this language of kind of like both law enforcement and the basketball people and the football people. It's like even up to and including Marty testifying. Like Marty had to testify, right? And Marty knew that he had to have a certain amount of remorse, but he knew it was kind of performative because he wasn't all that sorry. He was sorry that he stole all that money, but he felt like he'd kind of worked it off, and he and his wife would say he didn't take any money for himself. Well, I didn't point out to him that that's really not much of an excuse. You still took the money. You were spending it on experiences and hanging around with celebrities and stuff. But anyway, the point I'm making is that Marty was very good at picking up on signals. And I think we all do that in life. And I think the book, if you read it with that in mind, or think about it with that in mind, can teach you about how you interact with people in the world. Anyway, yeah, it's, the FBI expects you to be a certain way. The basketball guys want you to be a certain way. So I don't know if that's the right point to leave an interview, but it's true.
Marty clearly comes off as one of the more intelligent individuals who he's working.
He would want you to say that.
I mean, he does. One final question before we let you go. You obviously built this strong relationship with Marty throughout the course of the book. Outside of Marty, who was your favorite character to research and write about in this story?
I was pretty fascinated by Special Agent Scott Carpenter. It's not much of it. A lot of it didn't make the book for a bunch of reasons, but he got charged with stealing of the $13,000 to go gambling in Las Vegas. Is one of the scenes in the book. The special agent who was in charge of the case, and then when he pled out, and the proceeding was in Nevada. Maybe Arizona. I can't remember why it was where it was. Maybe that's where he lived. In any event, it was in the court records, and his wife wrote, there's letters from his parents, and his wife wrote a letter, and it just, the portrait that emerged of him, it's not really in the book nearly as much as it should be, in my view, but when you get to a certain point in a story, which these events are really towards the very end of the story, you're driving for the end. You don't reach back in time and spend 3 or 4 pages giving this exegesis, but he had an interesting and complicated backstory with the military and his marriage and his growing up wealthy in New Jersey and portraying himself as this sort of redneck guy. He went to Wake Forest. He got just enough of the southernness sprinkled on him at college. And then he had time in Iraq, and he clearly developed a real substance problem that he was able to sort of function through. To me, he was like a book in himself, if you would ever tell it. But as you say, there's these elements that are sort of funny, but that's actually was a really sad story in a way, because he really, really did undo himself, and he really harmed his wife. And they're, I hope that they're together. I hope they're on the mend. I hope that this book doesn't further harm them. I certainly don't go out of my way to do that. But, the idea of an FBI agent as a vulnerable, flawed person, to me, is really interesting. And I don't think that is something that is nearly often enough portrayed in society. Like what cops are really like, what's underneath the hood of all that power. So yeah, to me, that was really interesting. And another guy that I found interesting was Robert Boone. Those prosecutors, they have so much power, like, oh my God, and so Boone wore it well, and he was a man of his word. And so that's, to me, if there's going to be a redemptive character, it's Boone, who sort of had to make, lemonade out of these lemons.
Well, I will say the way you approach the writing of Special Agent Carpenter, early on in the story, you're laying out many of his characteristics as you just described them. And while I'm reading it in the moment, I'm thinking to myself, man, what's Guy got against this guy? Kind of the initial writing of it. And then when you drop the bomb on Las Vegas and what happens, it triggered for me. Oh, he probably had some fun writing about this guy.
I did have fun's not the right word, but it was more like, just to take you back to that Crip story that I wrote for GQ. I never got to sort of tell the real truth of what was going on with the FBI in that context. So for me, it was gratifying to sort of this is what it's really like. Like when you see James Comey, or any of these FBI guys, No. They're not that perfect guy testifying on television. They're the guy that goes home and is mean to their wife, or kicks their dog, or or is really a good guy, and there's different characteristics. I didn't have anything against Carpenter. What I felt about Carpenter was that he came from such a righteous place. Like, this is my case. I'm getting these bad guys. But the truth is that underneath it, and I mean, this is one of the other messages in the book, is that everybody's human. Everybody's flawed and making mistakes. And that was one of the elements that kind of, if there's anybody that I kind of felt a little aggrieved by, it was the mainstream sports media. It's been, since the book has been published in the last couple of days, it's been amazing to me that the publicists are talking to places like ESPN and, the usual sporting outlets, The Athletic, and, the podcast guys. And they're mostly saying, oh, we already covered that story. But they didn't. The way they covered this story was to say Marty Blazer's a sleazebag. And that's just one element of it. Like Marty's kind of survivalness, his ability to steal $2 million and not go to prison. I mean, that's pretty much a miracle, right? Like, I don't know if any of you guys are married, but if you are, would your wife stick with you after you stole $2 million? Like, you'd have to do a lot of fast talking, man. I know my wife would want to know. So
I doubt it. Yeah, but I don't know.
Event, like, I'm not bemoaning the black whatever their right. level of interest. It's just more like, no, you didn't cover the story because it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah,
and I think that's true of much sports journalism. That to just maybe finish right at a good spot, which is Marty sought me out explicitly for the reason that I'm not a sports writer.
Yep.
He didn't want some jock sniffer dude from, he had people like really pressuring him from ESPN, Sports Illustrated. Michael Lewis was chasing him at one point. He knew this was not a college sports story. This was a crime story. This was a story about corruption. This is a story about the fallen state of man. And so he wanted somebody who he knew could write about bad people in a non-judgmental way, which is kind of like my calling card. If you look at my the work I've done over the years, you'll see I've written about some of the worst people.
We'll leave it there. The book, Hot Dog Money, is available now. However you consume your literature, grab yourself a copy, find a shady spot somewhere warm, and enjoy the frenetic ride as Marty Blazer tries to balance life as a family man with that of a confidential informant. Thank you so much for joining us, Guy. Good juju to your week.
Guys.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys, so much.
Well, fellas, what'd you think of the interview with Guy Lawson?
I think the main thing that Guy touched on in the interview was that Marty, despite his flaws, was essentially just a family man trying to build a life for himself, his wife, and his kids, and trying to balance that out with a business and just getting caught up essentially on the wrong side of things. So I think he really brings home the point that at the heart of it all, Marty's just a good guy in a bad situation. And I think that's pretty much the main driving point of the entire story, aside from the investigation and all the shadiness that goes down with the whole operation.
And I find that interesting. And I do believe to a certain extent that is the position being put forth about Marty. But that entire perspective is built post him embezzling millions of dollars
correct
from his clients.
Right.
That is an entirely new form of enlightenment forced upon him by a government now breathing down his throat and not allowing him to go out and live wild times in strip clubs.
Sure.
Bars.
Right. Like I said, not a perfect person.
It's much easier to be a good person when the FBI is watching you and recording your every move.
I 100,000%. I 100,000% agree with that perspective.
So that's the confliction. And I think that even in the interview, Guy presents it that way, right?
Yeah.
Where, he understands a man and he's writing about a man from the perspective of what he's experienced and what he went through, writing through the lens of Marty Blazer. Of course, Marty Blazer feels like a victim. Marty Blazer stole millions of dollars from people. And I don't think that Guy even necessarily wants him to come off as a victim, but as a complicated human being. It's one of the plot lines I think I struggled with a little more.
Yeah, is definitely an interesting storyline for sure.
Like at any point, Marty Blazer couldn't have leveraged his own finances to get himself out of that hot water.
Right.
He had to steal it from his clients. Anyway, that's a great point, though. I think that's a really good point you bring up.
I think it's important to note the settlement. We just touched upon it briefly for about 15 seconds or so. But Pete, can you explain exactly what happened with the lawsuit that got essentially settled by the NCAA?
So essentially claiming that their, inability to earn income off of name, image, and likeness harmed them personally and financially, and that it was against the law for the NCAA to restrict their ability to earn in such a way. And the case settled for $2.8 billion or something like that. And the universities were then required to pay out some $2.8 billion in some form that I haven't paid enough attention to. To me, the real news is this breaks the dam. The government has now said, or the NCAA has now conceded, we pay players. So once they pay players, now the university can pay these guys directly as opposed to,
what's happening
relying
in the
on
stories, right?
boosters, relying on NIL clubs, relying on those sorts of outside sources to provide income for the athletes. Now, the whole course of this book, where it gets so interesting, is that this book really dives into how these middlemen get access to these players and why it's important to them that they have access to these players. By getting access to these high value players who eventually become pros, they then can sign on as managers or as financial planners or as agents or all these different roles, or to sign on with their shoe company, be their exclusive shoe company, all these different things. So when you attach them early, they aren't committed to anything necessarily. But the hope is when they are able to formally sign contracts, your goodwill, your hot dog money that you've been feeding them comes to fruition in the form of a contract. However, these are teenage kids. So how are teenagers being appropriately approached? Are the people who are putting teenagers in front of these people in their best interests? If it's not the university helping to regulate it with people who are in charge and well respected and are doing it not for a sense of their own pocket, but for a sense of this is my job to be doing this properly, and it's regulated, well, maybe that helps.
Yeah.
He seems skeptical.
Yeah. Well, there's a huge issue with these assistant coaches that he talks about taking the money.
These are their mentors.
Right.
These are like Chuck Persons was a father figure to Austin Wiley. And you read in the book just how close their relationship really was. And Chuck Persons goes down in the course of this investigation. And it's a really interesting read into, specific conversations that are recorded on FBI wires where they were able to transcribe and put into the book. Here's exactly what Chuck Persons was saying to Austin Wiley when they're beefing, and Chuck Persons is in the middle of trying to get $10,000 out of Marty Blazer at Austin Wiley's house.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy. Like, we all knew it was going on, right? To a degree.
Yeah.
But hearing the firsthand account is fascinating.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in the book, and we talked about it briefly in the interview, but we never really get to the head monster of it all, right?
There is no head is my takeaway from this. That's my understanding from what Marty, that's what had me so confused is I think when we ask, what are you really targeting? Who was the FBI really targeting? What's the real answer there? I mean, there is no answer. What are you going to say? Oh, we're going to try to put all the university presidents in jail? Right? We're going to go
Bring down Nike.
Yeah, is Phil Knight going to jail for this? Absolutely not. They're not doing any of that. So what's left? It's just the people who are operating an ecosystem with no regulation.
Yeah.
You don't have any choice but to live in this world.
Right.
So,
or even worse, pseudo self-regulated.
I find the universities themselves to be unintelligent beyond their years. Meaning the industry of sports has exploded over the last 100 years, unlike almost any other industry. Why do the universities not properly train and prepare the individuals who are passionate about pursuing these careers in these industries in the wide variety of ways you can?
Yeah. Even before the money, without the money, whatever.
Why isn't this being done?
Yeah.
Why aren't the universities they treat the athletes like the criminals instead of treating the athletes like the best prepared individuals stepping onto campus for the reason they're there?
Yeah.
And that does not follow logic. And it's unfortunate.
And the reason they're there is to bring in the money.
Which isn't being provided back to them.
Right.
And the reason the students are supposed to be there is to prepare themselves for the rest of their life. Yet that's not happening either, is your point.
Right.
Yeah.
Not in a proper way.
Right.
They're trying to force these kids into a version of university life that doesn't really make sense with their schedule, their routine, or what their real reason for being there is.
Yeah, their interest.
And I'm not saying there aren't plenty of athletes who want to go be engineers who are playing at college.
Yeah,
They
right,
should.
of course.
Yeah, support them. Support athletes the way athletes should be supported. I think that was a key takeaway here from Guy in our conversation.
Yeah.
All right. That's going to do it for us this week, folks. Thanks again to Guy Lawson for joining us. You can find his book, Hot Dog Money, on shelves now. Good juju to your bets, everyone. We'll talk again in 2 weeks with Sammy P. Talking NBA draft conspiracies with Good Juju.
I can't wait.
We're not even exactly certain where this conversation is going to go, but we're excited to talk with Sammy. He's a great follow on Twitter. You can find him on Nesson or on Fox Sports. So stay tuned for that, folks. We're going to have fun with him in 2 weeks. Good juju to your bets. We'll talk again soon.
Bye.